J Squad.
We gotta find. Now what do we do? That's the first clue. Now what do we do? That's the first clue. We gotta find.
All right, there we go. There we go. Let's get into it today. Boom, boom, boom. Pulling everything up. So, if you haven't noticed today, Nere, is that how you pronounce her name? I don't fucking know. I'm probably messing it up. Has been an absolute wretched bitch to Indy and Endymion. all day and he's mad at it. So what we're going to do today, what I want to do is we're going to go over her video. What is it called? The Death of Western Games. And we're just going to see what her takes are on gaming. See what's going on. Put in a little commentary. I like talking about things like this, so I may do it a little bit more, especially when it comes to gaming. Let's get this shit started, though.
Role-playing games have long been regarded as the epitome of interactive storytelling, transcending simple entertainment to offer players profound, meaningful experiences. From the very first text-based adventures to the expansive open worlds of modern titles, RPGs have not only allowed players to assume roles, but also to mold characters, navigate complex narratives, and influence the fates of entire universes. However, this medium has evolved over the decades, perhaps in ways that have unintentionally diminished the very essence that made it unique. This evolution represents one of gaming's most fascinating paradoxes. As RPGs have grown more technically sophisticated, visually stunning, and commercially successful, many genre purists argue they have simultaneously lost something fundamental. The journey from tabletop origins to digital dominance has been marked by critical design decisions that prioritize accessibility over depth, spectacle over agency, and guided experiences over genuine role-playing freedom. The earliest
Yeah, that's a lot of big words for a woman, but so far not wrong.
digital RPGs emerge as a direct translation of their tabletop counterparts, preserving complex character creation systems, stat-driven interactions, and narrative consequences that genuinely reflected player choice. Games like Ultima, Wizardry, and early Fallout titles demanded players inhabit their characters fully, making decisions based not just on optimal outcomes but on consistent role-playing principles. The mechanical underpinnings of these games supported this approach, with robust skill systems, faction dynamics, and dialogue trees that branched meaningfully based on character attributes rather than simplistic binary choices.
So yeah, she's talking about like Fallout 1 and 2, some of these older RPGs that came out. Here's the picture for it. Yeah, I mean, RPGs in general have been on kind of a downtrend since their beginning. You don't get games like Fallout 1 anymore, where the story is so deep and the choice is so out there. Like, you could make choices in Fallout 1 that you didn't know you could make. You can kill children and earn a perk called Child Killer. You can what is my favorite one? I was watching my brother play as a kid, and he decided to just start taking drugs like there was no tomorrow. His character overdosed, and it changed his intelligence to either 1 or 0. I don't quite remember. And then his entire dialogue for the rest of the game, well, he ended up saving, but for every character after that was him talking like a simpleton, while characters were reacting to him like he was a simpleton. They weren't just giving their basic lines. They would say something like, "Oh, honey, you doing okay? Would you like me to get you a sandwich?" They were treating him like the dummy he was, and you don't see that kind of choice and that kind of consequence in any games.
As technology advanced and market pressures intensified, developers began streamlining these systems. Character classes became less distinct, skill checks grew rarer in dialogue, and consequences for actions became increasingly cosmetic rather than structural. The industry's pivot towards action-oriented gameplay further accelerated this trend, with many modern RPGs offering little more than superficial character customization layered atop essentially linear action-adventure frameworks. Perhaps more tellingly, the narrative focus shifted dramatically. Where early RPGs presented worlds to be discovered through exploration and player initiative, contemporary titles increasingly deliver cinematic experiences where player involvement serves primarily to advance predetermined storylines. The player transitions from active participant shaping an emerging narrative to audience member occasionally steering a largely fixed one. This shift reflects broader cultural changes in entertainment consumption, where passive media experiences have conditioned audiences to expect polished, directed narratives rather than messy but authentic, player-driven stories. This is not merely a lament for the past, but a detailed autopsy of how the RPG genre metamorphosed. We'll dissect how, through shifts in mechanics, narrative design, and world building, the genre veered away from its rich roots, transforming into something arguably more accessible but ultimately less distinctive. In this exploration, we will trace the game mechanics, narrative designs, and philosophical choices that change the very fact.
She says, the accessible part. Yeah, that's kind of the direction they went, but seeing games come out now that are arguably less so, like Baldur's Gate 3, where you still have all of the crazy choice. Yeah, when you still have all the crazy choice, and the game blew up. It was even a genre that's been considered very niche, the CRPG genre. So I think companies wanted to feel that way, but I think if they would have kept to their guns and improved on the other things while continuing to tell those good stories, we would be in a whole different world.
Fabric of RPGs, leaving behind a legacy of missed opportunities and potential. In the heyday of turn-based combat, every combat encounter was an opportunity for storytelling. This was not just about hitting attack and hoping for the best, but about placing each decision within the broader context of the game's world. Classic RPGs like Baldur's Gate and Fallout understood that combat wasn't just a mechanic, it was an extension of the narrative itself. Each turn was a moment where the player's strategic decisions influenced the unfolding of events in a meaningful way. Final Fantasy and Shining Force utilized turn-based combat as a way to pause the action and allow players to think deeply about their choices, from positioning units on the battlefield to the precise use of resources. Combat, in this sense, felt deliberate, important, and tied into the very DNA of storytelling.
Well, it just wasn't just important, it was engaging. Like, you had the real-time strategy of like Baldur's Gate, and then you had the turn-based strategy of Fallout, but it wasn't just easy action. You had to think about the choices you made. Do I throw this grenade? Do I cast this spell? It felt engaging to figure out what was the right thing to do, what was the right kit to have.
These early systems created spaces for consequential decision-making that reflected character development. A mage with limited hit points didn't charge into battle. This tactical vulnerability wasn't just a gameplay constraint, but a narrative reinforcement of the character's identity. Similarly, positioning a heavily armored knight to protect weaker party members wasn't merely optimal play. It embodied the protective role that a character served within the group's dynamic. The measured pace allowed for dramatic tension to build naturally.
Hey, Vince, what's going on? What point was that? Did I miss it?
Players contemplated development. A mage with limited hit points didn't charge into battle. This tactical vulnerability wasn't just a gameplay constraint, but a narrative reinforcement of the character's identity. Similarly, positioning a heavily armored knight to protect weaker party members wasn't merely optimal play. It embodied the protective role that a character served within the group's dynamic. The measured pace allowed.
Yeah, I can see that, because in the end, game mechanics are game mechanics. I think what she's trying to go for is the idea of roles in gaming, which arguably really hasn't changed. Like, it's carried over into games like Fallout and things like that. True. May have to ask her what she's talking about with it. My argument would be that the combat was more, I would even say more difficult back then than the action RPGs that we have today, where everything is more about making it accessible so anyone can play, so they make it so easy that it makes it look like they think their audience is dumb. Versus, like, I remember as a kid, the game up front, Final Fantasy Tactics, could be fairly difficult, especially if you didn't set up right in the beginning. So Baldur's Gate 2, I spent a lot of time dying in as well.
For dramatic tension to build naturally, as players contemplated the weight of each action, creating memorable moments when a carefully planned strategy either succeeded brilliantly or failed catastrophically. Moreover, turn-based systems invited players to engage with the full breadth of their character's capabilities, rather than defaulting to the most obvious or efficient
that statement I don't know about, like full breadth of the character's capabilities. You could argue that it's limited, right? So while it's while you can pick any skills and magic and things like that, and the games gave you time to, the more action played style role playing gives you, how do I put it? Gives you a sense that your character is alive and making these decisions, you know? This is one of my favorite games of all time, but feeling like I have the full decision of the character when all they are doing is just going back and forth. Not really the same thing, I guess.
Vision attack patterns, players explore situational abilities, status effects, and environmental interactions that might otherwise be overlooked in faster-paced combat. Games like Chrono Trigger elevated
that I can go with. I think I might have paused Andy there for what she was going for. Yeah, you definitely do have like status effects in combat RPGs is really, they're usually non-consequential. Hence why I didn't like the video. They go for more flowery language over direct, but that is me. I mean, yeah, she's a woman, so it's going to be a flowery language. I don't mind the idea of trying to pull the, I guess, more flowery side. I'll use your same word for it. But yeah, you could be a little bit more direct on what you mean by these particular items.
This approach by implemented combo attacks that encourage players to consider party composition as an extension of storytelling. Certain characters working together reflected their narrative relationships and development arcs. However, over time, combat systems evolve under the pressure of technological innovation and shifting player expectations. The rise of action-based combat, as seen in Dark Souls, was hailed as a breakthrough. Its fast-paced, reflexive nature challenged players to master timing and movement. While mechanically impressive, it shifted the role of combat away from strategic storytelling into a test of player dexterity. What was once a narrative choice became an adrenaline-filled performance, where precision reflexes replaced critical thinking and the careful weighing of options.
So I don't know about this much either. We're talking about like the Souls-like genre, while it has RPG elements in it, it's not really an RPG. The storytelling is usually very minimal to like the background area that you find it out as, and it is more of a skill-based game. The idea is reactions and being able to dodge, parry, and do everything at the right time. I don't consider it part of the RPG genre. One thing that happened as games were changing over to more action-based gameplay is they were stealing, not stealing is the wrong word, they were pulling those RPG elements that people loved out and adding it into games, because RPG elements make you feel more connected to your character. You understand? It makes you like you feel that level gain. And that's one thing that people get into, is feeling yourself get more powerful. So RPG elements do that. I would argue that games with RPG elements are not the same as a RPG, right? When I think RPG, I think storytelling. I think player choice and how I get to decide how the story goes. That's arguable with like JRPGs. With JRPGs, it's always been more the story that kind of falls into it. CRPGs, story and turn-based combat, or story and party-based combat. But I don't know. I don't think I would have pulled Souls-likes into this.
This transition was not inherently negative. Action combat systems can be brilliantly executed and deeply engaging. Yet something fundamental was sacrificed in this evolution: the intrinsic connection between combat mechanics and character identity. When success depends primarily on the player's physical skill rather than character attributes and strategic thinking, the role-playing element diminishes. A wizard and a warrior might employ different animations and visual effects, but the core experience increasingly revolves around similar timing-based mechanics regardless of character type. In modern
Now, I can agree with that on, especially with an idea like Veilguard. Veilguard is trying to be a story-driven RPG with action-based combat, but you look at games like that, like if you look at the difference between Inquisition and Veilguard. Yeah, Dying Light. It's not an RPG. It's a first person, zombie survival with RPG mechanics, but it in itself isn't an RPG. RPG mechanics have made games the way they are because, well, they're just superior. But again, when it comes to like other games that are out there, what was I even at for this one? Let me re-listen. You
when success depends
shot me
primarily
off.
on the player's physical skill rather than character attributes and strategic thinking, the role-playing element diminishes. A wizard and a warrior might employ different.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. So when you move to, they argued with you in the comments. That's funny. I mean, the thing is, people want to tell you. I told you I'm evil. Oh, you wait. You've seen me on Twitter. But anyway, back to what I was saying here is when you look at something like Veilguard, where they switched from Inquisition's more RPG style mechanic, where you had control of the other characters minimally, and the combat was less controlled by you, more your RPG mechanics mattered more, right? You building to be the shield for your character, being the tank, as they would say now. You're using those RPG mechanics more than you are in Veilguard, where it's really just a very paper thin RPG system to give you the illusion of leveling up and becoming more powerful. There's really no difference in Veilguard from a mage to a fighter. There's no difference in the type of power. There's no care for party composition, which is something she mentions, right?
Animations and visual effects, but the core experience increasingly revolves around similar timing-based mechanics regardless of character type.
I'd argue that Veilguard and some of those games don't really give a shit about timing mechanics. Timing mechanics is strictly a Souls-like thing.
In modern titles, combat no longer feels like an extension of the world building, but often a hollow pursuit of a spectacle. It's a trend seen across the industry, where developers prioritize visually striking combat systems at the expense of strategic depth and meaningful player choice.
This is true. This is a very true statement. They want it to look good. They don't want it to be deep and engaging. Well, it's not that they don't want it to be. It's easier to make it look good and shiny because they think people will buy it.
Games like Dragon Age Inquisition attempted to bridge this divide with hybrid systems.
Just like YouTubers want to make the easiest slop imaginable so they can get their clicks, gaming companies want to make the easiest games imaginable so that they can get money.
But often resulted in unsatisfying compromises that pleased neither traditionalist nor action enthusiast. The tactical overlay feature, ostensibly included to preserve strategic elements, frequently went unused as players defaulted to direct control and reflex-based engagement. The industry's embrace of accessibility often served as a justification for this simplification, but in streamlining these systems, developers inadvertently flattened the very features that made RPG combat distinctive. Complex status effects, positioning advantages.
If she's talking about more turn-based RPG mechanics, then I would agree up until probably the last couple of years, right? Oblivion, Morrowind, these type of games I would consider RPGs, even though they have an action mechanic. You could give them a flashier action mechanic in a way, and they would still have that RPG focus. Like if I make a mage, I have to play my mage very different than I would have to play my sword and board guy, right? I think that's where it comes to a difference, is when you're making a character, for an RPG, at least an RPG where you're leveling up and things like that, what are the choices you have? Well, in a CRPG, it's going to be party based. So I want to build each party member for a specific task. If it's something like Oblivion, you want to build your character for the play style you want to be with. Veilguard, because I'm going to shit on it probably the entire time we're talking about this, it's none of those things. You're playing a character with mage flavor, character with fighter flavor, character with archer flavor, but there's no depth to the actual character besides making your abilities look different. Doesn't change the combat at all.
And resource management decisions gave way to more homogenized combat loops focused on damage output and spectacle. What was lost wasn't merely mechanical complexity, but the narrative texture that these systems once provided. The sense that combat reflected something meaningful about character and identity in the world itself. In the early
Yeah, I think when she's talking about identity, she's really trying to say your playstyle, the ability to build your playstyle within the game or build your party composition or something like that versus flavorless stuff. She showed World of Warcraft in that, and yeah, you could argue well, even then with what makes World of Warcraft a good RPG and popular as it was you making your character for your playstyle.
RPGs, stat allocation was far more than a mere number crunching exercise. It was a philosophical commitment. It represented who your character was in the world. A character with low strength but high intelligence wasn't simply a weak fighter. They were someone who relied on wit and cunning, perhaps using diplomacy or trickery to resolve conflicts. The way a player allocated stats spoke volumes about the role they wanted to play in the narrative, and how they saw their character fitting into the larger world.
Yeah, that's what she is trying to point towards. Not so much the story told by your character more than the play style. I mean, there are people like me very much. I have headcanon story while I play a game. So I build my characters with a story in mind. But for most gamers, it's going to generally be some type of play style you build through your characters.
Games like Baldur's Gate and Planetscape Torment embraces philosophy wholeheartedly.
Planetscape Torment. You're not a real gamer. You can't even pronounce it right.
A highly charismatic character might talk their way past obstacles that would require combat for others. A perceptive character might not...
Well, what makes Torment special is the game is not designed around the combat, right? The game Torment and its predecessor are designed around the story. Yes, there's combat in it, but it's more storybook than it is anything else. Same thing with, I forget the name of this game. They don't drive you to combat like Baldur's Gate will. You're going to have to battle in Baldur's Gate. You don't have to do a single fight in Planescape.
Notice hidden passages or deceptions that others would miss entirely. These weren't simply different means to the same end. They represented fundamentally different journeys through the game world, with unique narrative consequences and discoveries tied to each approach. This system created natural replayability that emerged organically from character identity rather than arbitrary achievement hunting. Players would return to these worlds not just to experience different endings, but to inhabit entirely different roles within the same narrative framework. The limitations imposed by stat distribution weren't frustrating restrictions, but the very foundation of role-playing. They define not just what...
Hey, yeah, Disco Elysium, that's the name. Welcome. Kamoji. I'll never pronounce your name right. I'll keep trying, though. Yeah, Planescape is more Disco Elysium than Baldur's Gate. Yeah, exactly. I would have paired those two together over Baldur's Gate. Even then, Baldur's Gate is pretty much on a rail system where both of those games can have very different outcomes. You know what I mean? A lot of times with Baldur's Gate, you are on a rail playing the story. Not the third one, of course, but the first and second. You just get to make choices around the other stuff.
Your character could do, but who they fundamentally were. Fast forward to contemporary RPGs, where character creation has often been reduced to choosing an avatar and tweaking some numbers. Many modern titles such as those in the Mass Effect or the Elder Scrolls series still feature skill systems, but the impact of those choices has diminished. Specialization, once a cornerstone of RPG design, has all but disappeared. Players can easily respect their stats, removing the very concept of limitations and the narrative depth those limitations once provided. The result? Characters feel interchangeable, and
So let me listen to the
experience
rest of this
carving
because I
out a
think I
unique
disagree
identity
here.
in the game world is less fulfilling. This erosion extends beyond numerical attributes to the very idea of character identity. Modern RPGs increasingly position players as universal protagonists, capable of mastering every skill, joining every faction, and experiencing all content in a single playthrough.
I mean, I can argue there's truth to that with Baldur's Gate, or not Baldur's Gate, Morrowind and Oblivion and some of those other titles. Not so much with Mass Effect. Mass Effect was a very clear story that what it did super well was choice mattered in that game. And I remember playing my first playthrough of Baldur's Gate and having to pick between two characters that I had grown to, care for or care about in the game. So it was like heartbreaking having to watch one of them die. So there is a loss in story, and I can agree to an extent with player choice. Like the classes weren't all that different or didn't play all that different in Mass Effect. What Mass Effect did change though what Mass Effect did have was consequences for your actions, which really hadn't been a thing outside of maybe Fallout or Planescape or Torment, excuse me.
While superficially empowering, this approach fundamentally undermines the role-playing premise. When a character can become guild master of both the Thieves Guild and the Mages College without any meaningful conflict or consequence, the world itself feels less coherent and responsive.
You could say that, but you could also say that I'm based because not only am I the best assassin in the world, but I'm also the best fighter and the best mage.
The industry's emphasis on quality of life improvements has inadvertently contributed to this decline. Features like simplified skill trees, automatic leveling options, and recommended builds cater to convenience at the expense of meaningful player investment in character development. While ostensibly making games more accessible, these changes have hollowed out what once made character creation a profound act of self-expression within the game world. Perhaps most concerning is how this shift reflects a broader philosophical change in how players are expected to engage with these worlds. The original ethos of roleplaying emphasized inhabiting a character with specific strengths, weaknesses, and perspectives, embracing limitations as part of the narrative experience. Today's design philosophy increasingly treats limitations as frustrations to be eliminated, resulting in protagonists who are less characters within a world and more avatars for experiencing content without meaningful restrictions or consequences. Once upon a time, RPGs excelled in dialogue complexity. Planetscape Torment famously featured multi-layered conversations that could stretch hundreds of words, diving into deep philosophical questions about existence, morality, and the nature of the self.
So, I mean, a lot of this comes back to story and how story has degraded over time. I mean, gameplay has too, but there was arguably a shift in the market away from turn-based combat and different things like that. And honestly, gamers wanted probably, to make the audience bigger, people wanted easier features. They didn't want a big complex game like Torment. There was an audience for it. There was definitely a big audience. I agree. Dialogue isn't everything to story. It's how the story is built. But dialogue can help drive that story. You know what I mean? Or choice in that dialogue can help drive that story, I think. I think it's more engaging for choice in there than just doing the Fallout thing where It's always going to be the same, and it's the illusion of choice. It's about how that story engages with you. Where on the opposite hand, a game like Final Fantasy, I don't care much about player choice. I care about the overall arching story and eventually killing gods.
Characters weren't simply there to give you quests, they were integral to shaping the narrative, offering different viewpoints and challenging the player's ideas. These dialogues weren't merely verbose, they were architecturally complex. Conversations branched based on character attributes, previous
Environmental storytelling, the reason I still respect Bethesda despite their many, many flaws. Yeah, Bethesda and Bethesda has for a long time been kind of the king of that environmental storytelling, right? There's nothing quite as engaging as going into a vault and reading about what happened to that vault through those story elements. And what's great about them is if that's not your deal, you can completely ignore them. I'm a Fallout purist when it comes to my game. Fallout and Fallout 2 are the best in the Fallout series, but I love them for what they are. Dark Souls, it works well. Yeah, I can agree with that. My argument against that is it's more difficult to read into those stories. I don't think that's a bad thing, right? That's engaging for those lore whores that love to go in and find every little bit of story that they can get their hands on. And it's so ambiguous that people can create entire videos on the lore. But that's not necessarily, that one's a more niche experience than, say, Fallout's storytelling through environment.
Decisions and accumulated knowledge, creating a web of potential interactions rather than a linear path. A player with high intelligence might unlock philosophical discussions that were simply unavailable to other character builds. In Fallout, a low intelligence character would receive an
Yeah, well, I'm saying it is a choice. It's just more vague, right? Like I haven't really played much. I'm not, I may never be skilled enough for those games. I'm going to buy Elden Ring and try it out. Dark Souls wasn't my jam. And I don't know that I would have been autistic enough to go into those deep stories. Now, what I love doing is going onto YouTube, and I'm a lore whore, and as in I let other people gather it, and then I go watch videos on it. So it's cool to see that people could pull those stories out of the game and it'd be more ambiguous. I wish a lot of things in gaming were more like that.
entirely different dialogue options, fundamentally altering the player's experience of the narrative. The fact that entire questlines, insights, and relationships could be locked behind specific character attributes meant that conversations themselves became explorations, archaeological digs into the game's narrative possibilities. The density of these dialogue systems created a particular kind of
It's funny to see this game. One of the anti-woke retards that was arguing with me said that this particular game, Vampire the Masquerade, was just a bad, shitty game and woke. And I would argue that this game, its RPG mechanics and its dialogue and choice things are really good, and I would almost call this a cult classic in its nature.
Immersion, one that demanded attention and rewarded careful reading. Games like Arcanum of Steamworks and Magic Obscura and Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines trusted players to engage with complex.
It wouldn't work as well without the internet. Yeah, it's like I said, as niche as Souls-likes feel, because I would argue that they're not that niche because people really were craving that challenge. Their storytelling was even more niche, and I would have never learned about any of it without the internet.
Political factions, philosophical schools of thought, and moral quandaries without simplification. This approach treated players as intellectual participants in the narrative rather than merely emotional ones, expecting them to weigh competing worldviews and form their own conclusions.
I don't like the way it says intellectual. I mean, I guess that's sort of true. It's just more this is the big problem with the anti-woke stuff, or with the woke stuff, right? This is why it became such a big deal, is it's telling a nuanced conversation, like Disco Elysium is a very communist kind of socialist style game, that it's looking at that in a more positive light. Then at least that's my understanding of it. I haven't played the game fully for myself, so it's telling it through a lens. What makes it fairly good is how it's told, where Veilguard is very much trying for the trans inclusive argument, but it is not well done. It doesn't fit within the story, and it takes you out of it. So, right, all art wants to tell a story. Games are not any different, for the most part. And how that story is told can make people think about something different if they go that far into thinking about it.
Fast forward to the present day, and dialogue has become shorter, more formulaic, and focused on instant emotional payoffs. AAA RPG
I wouldn't say shorter, I would say giving the illusion of choice.
is now feature interactions that range from one-liners to quippy exchanges designed to evoke
It's not as tanky friendly as people think. It's an interesting one to me. I like the idea of going through it as a story. It's on my bucket list, so we'll see. I'll judge it eventually, hopefully before I die.
immediate emotional responses rather than provoke critical thought or challenge the player. In The Witcher 3, while still beautifully written, most conversations are purposefully designed for maximum player engagement, quick, easy to understand, and emotionally charged. The complexity of choice, however, has been drastically diminished. The modern dialogue
Yeah, but The Witcher 3 I compare to older RPGs in the way that it's on a rails, right? There's not, the story is going to play out the way it's going to play out. But where a game like The Witcher 3 excelled was in its side story. Yeah, very linear. Linear is a better word than on rails. Where it excelled was in its side stories. Yeah, there was a simplicity to them, but they were engaging, and yeah, you can get lost in their side stories. Just there was so much more nuance, and they told the story of the world through those side quests, which made the main story, as linear as it was, more engaging. So I put Witcher 3 up in high tier RPGs, and actually a point towards RPGs getting better.
will, popularized by Mass Effect and now ubiquitous across the genre, epitomizes this shift. Conversations are reduced to simplify emotional tones: aggressive, diplomatic, humorous, or investigative. This system prioritizes accessibility and pacing over nuance, reducing the art of conversation to a series of emotional stances rather than substantive exchanges of ideas. While these systems allow for voice
I don't necessarily care if it's an exchanging of ideas, right? That it doesn't always have to be an exchanging of ideas. Mass Effect was made to be fun, and it was made to make you care about the characters and the consequences of your action. They kind of lost that idea towards the end. Player choice mattered less and less, but that was like the initial start of the first one and into the second one. So it's a different way of telling it without being a story to teach you something, right? I mean, you can argue there's the idea of saving the world and trying to bring people together who have differences, but it's kind of surface level.
protagonists and more cinematic presentations, they have fundamentally altered how players engage with narrative content, favoring immediacy over depth. It's impossible to ignore the influence of broader media trends on video game writing. Hollywood's emphasis on
So that kind of depends on how you consider depth, right? I would say Witcher 3 has a lot of depth because of its side quests. I would argue that Fallout and Oblivion have depth because of their environmental storytelling. You could even go into there's more depth in the way you create your character in those two games, where there is no depth to that in Mass Effect. The depth in Baldur's Gate 3 is in the choices that you can make that affect the world, as well as the character building. It's probably one of the best examples of it being similar to older days.
Quick, marketable dialogue and emotional beats embodied in blockbusters like the Marvel Cinematic Universe has permeated into the RPG space. Developers are now more concerned with ensuring their characters are relatable, often to the point of sounding undistinguishable. Quips, snarky remarks, and emotionally predictable arcs dominate the conversation, leaving little room for the kind of rich thematic dialogues that was once a hallmark of the genre. This shift manifests in multiple ways. Characters
Well, I get what she's saying here. She's talking about the everything becoming like Guardians of the Galaxy. That's more of a trend that you see, right? Not developers, the corpo business guys at the top have no connection to the players at the bottom who want to buy the game. And even then you can say that the devs don't have the same connection. So what happens at the top is these dudes see Guardians of the Galaxy be so popular and MCU as a whole in its first thing be so popular. So they're like, what people want is quippy dialogue. So we're going to put that into everything. And then it becomes annoying. It's like them taking new young kid language and pretending that they're the cool kids, right? There are different types of subgenres. You can't really compare action-oriented RPGs to start stat checks type of RPGs like that. One is going to have a better story, player interaction. The other will have a better action / combat, etc. Yeah, MCU humor has been the disaster for millennial writing. Absolutely. I have tried to pick up new horror books, and every single one of them pulls me out because the character has a quirky attitude. But yeah, you're not wrong. Like, what happened to RPGs? You could say what happened to RPGs is where everything could be in a full package. For something like Fallout, as new subgenres started to open up, they took the features that they wanted out of it and tried to improve on features that they wanted to put in it. Action combat, like you're talking about, over story, or action combat over deep RPG mechanics. I'll point you to Yick because it's the pinnacle of millennial writing. Oh, God. I'll take a look at it. But man, I roll my eyes. And I'm very much considered a millennial by my age. 1984 is apparently the cutoff date. But this seems like, I would say she's being a little nitpicky on the idea that every story has to, or every game has to meet this idea of the character you make tells a story. The story has to be engaging on topics. You know, it's a very, everything has to be perfect over the differences of those games. That reminds me, did you ever try Feed the Newsflesh trilogy? It isn't new, but 2013. I don't remember talking to you about that, actually, but that is my ADHD old man riddled brain. I will look into that, though. Feed the Newsflesh trilogy. Feed the Newsflesh trilogy. All right, I'm gonna look that up. I've been reading Hyperion. I think that's as close to sci-fi horror as I'll ever get, besides some niche cases and shitty YouTube stories. But let's continue on.
Increasingly speak in a homogenized writer's voice, rather than distinct in dialogues or speech patterns tied to their backgrounds. Regional accents and linguistic quirks, once used to subtly reinforce world building, give way to universally accessible banter. Companions and NPCs deliver carefully calibrated one-liners designed for maximum meme potential rather than authentic character development.
I would argue this started out as a good thing, right? It was a new idea that the characters, while you were walking around, would banter at each other. It gave a more realistic approach than them walking around silently, right? And it allowed for little bits of story detail. I would argue, as it became more popular, devs got lazier with it, and they just tried to make it very simple. You know, Dragon Age Inquisition was kind of well known for its shitty banter. I remember getting annoyed with it and thinking I wanted a button turned off for it. But there are some that it told a story and you couldn't wait for those witty one-liners or those memes, right? It's a tool that was used. It wasn't something built to make it lazier. It was built to add to the story and then later became lazy.
The goal seems to be creating characters.
I say that I miss when RPGs had your character wasn't the king of the world and instead someone that lived in it, if that makes sense. Yeah, there definitely became this drive to make you the most powerful character, right? What do they call the Japanese version of it? I don't know. I don't watch enough anime anymore. But that idea that you're the hero, you're the biggest character in the room. Fallout originally, you're trying to save your vault, but you are not at all the hero in that game. You can't just take down tons of people, especially not in the beginning. The Dragonborn. Yeah, the Dragonborn was, I think, one of the first steps into that idea, though I'm pretty sure there were some others around that time, right? I don't think there's anything wrong with that, too. Like, I loved being the Dragonborn and the hero, but there's also something incredibly engaging about being a shithead who's just like everybody else, right?
Who could seamlessly transition into transmedia properties rather than those who meaningfully inhabit specific fictional worlds. Perhaps most tellingly, modern RPG dialogue increasingly avoids genuine ideological diversity or challenging perspectives.
Yeah, this is more of the challenging perspectives or ideology. I don't think it has to have that. I think there are stories that I think you can make stories like that if you want to, but you can use a lot of these things as storytelling mechanics, to build upon the world, to make it seem more alive, more real. It's like when they moved from all of the characters standing still in a town to them moving around, and then upgrading it to some of them had paths from the beginning of their day to the end of their day. It made the world feel more alive, right? You go into, say, Cyberpunk, now, not the old one, the city feels alive because the people are moving. Ooh, excuse me. Whereas in the olden days, you play, the old Final Fantasy games, it's a maybe 1 or 2 step path, and then it repeats itself. Well, maybe 3 or 4 step path. So I don't think the engaging dialogue has to be there if the purpose of the tool is to increase the story, right?
For classic RPGs like Fallout New Vegas feature factions with fundamentally different, morally complex worldviews, contemporary titles often reduce political and philosophical differences to simplistic conflicts that are easily resolved through player intervention. The result is narratives that feel thematically shallower and less willing to challenge players with genuinely difficult ethical decisions or uncomfortable perspectives. The standardization of dialogue patterns across major studios
This game is not an RPG. It's just an action game with some role-playing elements.
Further reinforces this trend. As developmental teams grow larger and more international, dialogue undergoes multiple rounds of revision, localization, and focus testing. Processes that, while necessary for global releases, often sand away linguistic idiosyncrasies and cultural specificity. What emerges are conversations designed not to offend, confuse, or challenge, but to deliver reliably engaging emotional beats across cultural contexts. The modern RPG faces a unique challenge, balancing the desire for inclusive representation with the necessity for meaningful narrative complexity. In an effort to be more inclusive, games are often tempted to adopt a checkbox approach to character creation and storylines, where characters are assigned identities for the sake of diversity, but without the depth or context needed to make those characters feel real or integral to the story. The result is often a shallow veneer of representation, where characters exist more as symbols than as fully realized people.
There is truth to this. I'll give her this. You see a lot more of the idea of, well, it needs to be this type of character. We need this type of character. We need this type of character. We need a black woman. We need a Chinese woman. We need this. But no one's building these characters, right? It feels like they're being forced to put in a character, but not given the thought process or the ability to write an engaging character. You know what I mean?
This approach creates a fundamental tension. Characters become simultaneously hyper-visible as representatives of particular identities, while their actual narrative development receives less attention than in previous generations of RPGs. Where older titles might have dedicated substantial dialogue trees to exploring a character's background, beliefs, and personal growth, modern games often relegate such development to optional side conversations that many players never experience. The commercial imperative to appeal
I would argue that, at least in the time frame she's showing, that was kind of the thing too. Like, you didn't have to engage with every single player. There was just enough at the forefront to build the idea of who they were.
Appeal to the widest possible audience means that these personal narratives rarely challenge players' preconceptions or explore genuine cultural complexity. The representation paradox extends beyond character development to world building itself. Fantasy worlds that once drew inspiration from a specific historical context or cultural traditions increasingly adopt generic settings where social structures lack the specificity that might create meaningful narrative friction. Racism, classism, and religious conflict, themes that creators like BioWare once explored with relative nuance, are either absent entirely or presented in simplified metaphorical forms that avoid engaging with the messy realities of these issues.
Yes and no. Like, yeah, BioWare used to be very good at telling these kind of stories from the side. Like, I was really engaged with the first Dragon Age game and the themes of racism and stuff like that. Let me re-listen to that.
With relative nuance are either absent entirely or presented in simplified metaphorical forms that avoid engaging with the messy realities of these issues.
I don't know that I would say metaphorical terms. It's usually more hand-fisted, right? Example is, like, you can tell. Here's a comparison for you. Dragon Age Inquisition had what was a nuanced approach to a trans character, right? Yes, I agree. Better examples would have helped this out a lot, because I'm kind of pulling from what I'm seeing in front of me versus her giving the examples of it. I would also argue that while it's brought into the limelight a lot more, there's fewer games than people think that do this ham-fistedness, right? Vince is getting angry in chat. He's about to go call Nere a whore on X. But I mean, it's ham-fisted. It's not metaphorical. It's straight out telling it to you. Dragon Age Inquisition had a trans character that if you weren't paying attention, you would have never known it was trans. It was the typical story. She is a woman. Hurt her feel. Oh, it's a, nuanced character story. Was that story incredibly good? That I don't know, but it wasn't as in your face as having a conversation about doing push-ups every time you misgendered somebody, right? You could show what they did in Veilguard. You could show respectfully people respecting the person's wishes without bringing it to the forefront. And people would engage with that more than the shitstorm that was Veilguard.
This trend leads to characters that are more performative than they are profound.
She
Their
is woman, hear
identities
her
are often reduced to
feel.
a set of characteristics or a catchphrase, devoid of the cultural and personal nuance that made characters in older RPGs feel multidimensional. Where a character like Kreia in Knights of the Old Republic 2 embodied a complex philosophical position that challenged the player throughout the narrative, modern companions often represent simplified personality types rather than distinctive worldviews. The irony is that in attempting to create more inclusive narratives, many modern RPGs have actually reduced the depth and specificity that would make diverse characters truly compelling. Representation without depth ultimately undermines its own goals, creating the appearance of diversity while failing to engage with the rich complexity of human experience.
I think one thing I could say that Nero could do better on this video altogether is break it up into sections. Like we're flip-flopping between character building as a story in RPG mechanics, or character building losing its nuance, and then immediately going into how gaming is less in depth than it used to be. And I mean, a lot of this can be chalked up really to corporate laziness on just trying to find the line on how, that's the wrong way to say it, to finding the lazy line, to make it as quick as possible while still making the player think that they're nuanced, right? Or that it's a deeper story.
Experience that makes diverse perspectives valuable in the first place. The most successful modern RPGs are those that recognize this paradox and work to provide both breadth of representation and depth of characterization, understanding that genuine inclusion requires more than visual diversity. It demands narrative investment. In the golden era of RPGs, worlds were not just large, they were carefully curated. Developers spent years meticulously crafting each area to feel not just like a place to explore, but like a piece of a larger story. Games like Baldur's Gate and Planetscape Torment were celebrated not only for their detailed environments, but also for the way those environments were imbued with history and purpose. Every corner of the map had a reason for existing. Each street in Baldur's Gate wasn't just a space to navigate, but a narrative vehicle, telling stories through its architecture, NPC interactions, and questlines. Players didn't just explore, they uncover meaning in the world around them. These handcrafted worlds foster a particular kind of immersion that emerged from narrative density rather than a mere spatial vastness. The Hive in Planetscape Torment wasn't impressive for its size, but for its layered complexity. Every NPC, storefront, and back alley felt connected to the district's history, economy, and social dynamics. Similarly, locations like Athkatla in Baldur's Gate 2 weren't designed as playgrounds but as living communities with internal logic, political tensions, and historical significance. When players discover a hidden room or stumble upon an obscure NPC, they weren't just finding content, they were deepening their understanding of the world itself. This approach to world design treated environments as text to be read.
I agree with how they built the world and making it. Yeah, good complex doesn't equal good. That's a good way to say it. And there are plenty of places that, and NPCs in the world that just had silly one-liners that didn't really tell anything more about the story. It was a common place to fill it with there, and you had to at least give every NPC some, or almost every NPC, some kind of dialogue to make it feel alive. But I would argue that that was never the like every inch of the game is this perfect world building idea, right? If I would say any game did it better, or if any company did it better, we'll say that because multiple of their games did it with world building, it was oh God, I just lost it. Bethesda. And then I would argue again for, like you said, Dark Souls and most Souls like in general do a really good job of of telling the story with the world. So you can look at something small in a Dark Souls game and get a lot of detail out of it.
Read rather than merely spaces to be traversed. The architecture of Sigil in Planetscape wasn't arbitrary, but reflective of the city's impossible metaphysical
Planescape.
position. The layout of Vol City in Fallout 2 communicated volumes about its isolationist ideology in class structure without requiring explicit exposition. These environments achieved a kind of environmental storytelling that worked in concert with the game's narrative, rather than merely serving as its backdrop. In stark contrast, we now live in an age of procedural generation, where the vastness of worlds is prioritized over the depth within them. Games like Starfield promise players a nearly endless universe of over 1,000 planets to explore. It's an impressive technical feat, but it comes at the cost of meaningful content.
Well, it wasn't that impressive a feat. There was another game that did it way better, and arguably even with its storytelling, even though in the beginning the worlds pretty much all looked the same.
Really generated worlds often lack the cohesion and storytelling that handcrafted locations offer. A vast number of planets means that most of them are bereft of intricate lore, quest, or unique environments, leaving them as mere empty landscapes. Exploration becomes about collecting resources or ticking off checklists, rather than diving into a world rich with narrative depth. This shift towards procedural generation has fundamentally altered the relationship between players and the game worlds. Where exploration in traditional RPGs was motivated by curiosity and narrative discovery, modern open worlds often incentivize exploration through achievement systems and collectible hunts. The joy of uncovering a hidden story has been largely replaced by the dopamine hit of clearing icons from a map. Even when handcrafted,
Well, that's actually kind of done with now. It doesn't really get anybody anymore. Yeah, I mean, procedural generation has helped out world building. There's some companies that are using it as a crutch, Starfield being one of them, right? And like I said, there were better procedurally generated games that came out.
content exists within these procedural generated frameworks, it often feels disconnected from its surroundings, narrative islands in scenes of algorithmic emptiness. This shift towards algorithmic creation has diluted the magic that RPG worlds once held. When a world is built by hand, it reflects the creative intent and vision of its developers. Procedural generation, while impressive, doesn't capture the same nuance. The player feels less like a part of a living, breathing world and more like a tourist in a vast artificial sandbox. The irony is that technological advancement has enabled the creation of visually stunning environments with unprecedented detail, yet these spaces often feel less alive than the comparatively primitive worlds of earlier RPGs. Modern games can render individual leaves on trees and realistic weather patterns, but struggle to create places that feel like they existed before the player arrived and will continue to exist after they leave, a quality that even text-based MUDs and early CRPGs somehow managed to achieve with far fewer resources. In the past, RPG worlds didn't.
Well, it was able to achieve that in smaller RPG or in older RPGs because it was much easier to handcraft the entire world than it is today, right? There is that level of complexity where they've had to give up, like they can't necessarily handcraft 100 planets, or they not even necessarily. There's no way they could handcraft 100 planets in the time to get the game out. It's just not possible. The problem with Starfield is they gave this promise of diverse worlds using their NASA punk style, but the procedural generation was just the same style of planets over and over again, right? I can guarantee you that Baldur's Gate 3 is not 100% handcrafted maps. They probably do use some procedural generation in there, but they go back in on top of it and add in handcrafted elements to make the map feel more alive.
Begin and end at the game's start and finish screens. The narrative in the universe could continue to evolve through novels, comics, developer interviews, and fan-driven lore. Think of the Elder Scrolls series, where players could dive into a multitude of books within the game world, each one expanding the history and culture of Tamriel.
You have to be... What name needs some randomizer? Anyway. Yes, you know, there was a lot of storytelling and books and things like that in Oblivion and the Elder Scrolls series in general. And I don't think they should stop doing that, but it takes a special autistic person to read through all of those books. So you can't use that as a crutch to say it's, you know, adds more depth to the game. You have to have things that the average person will encounter to make the world, which I think some Elder Scrolls game, a lot of Elder Scrolls games do really well at. I encountered the same base like 3 times and 3 different bases in Starfield, same dead bodies in the same place in each. Yeah, their procedural generation doesn't even have enough depth to make a different world. It's very lazy and lackluster compared to other games that do the same thing with it, right?
Similarly, Final Fantasy lore didn't just live on screen but expanded into spin-off games, anime, and other media, enriching the player's understanding of its universe.
Yeah, but I argue I don't ever read all of the side material for anything. I just can't be bothered or I'm not interested enough. So I almost think that these kind of elements can end up hurting the experience for a vast majority of people who don't. Like, I'm not a comic book reader. I'm not going to go read the comic books that are in between the game. If the game can't tell me you know, how the world has changed or what's going on between game 1 and game 2, I don't want to have to go read said material or watch said material to understand it.
This transmedia approach wasn't merely additive, but transformative, creating narrative ecosystems where different media forms contributed unique elements to a cohesive whole. The Forgotten Realms setting that housed Baldur's Gate was simultaneously explored through novels, tabletop campaigns, and other video games.
So this is just flat out wrong. This was already like Baldur's Gate is not a game that built upon the story. Baldur's Gate was built from the story that is D&D, an already pre-established world. Did The Force Awakened annoy you? I didn't read any of the signed content. I haven't played the second one yet, so I don't know. If I get into the second game and I don't understand what's going on, then yeah, I'll probably be pretty annoyed. I may be able to, like, I don't have to know it immediately. You don't have to tell me the entire fucking story of what happened in between at the beginning of the game, right? But as I'm going through the game, I should be learning what happened around these times, right? It's like putting in a character who's in a situation that they don't, you know, the amnesia thing, they don't know who they are, and you're basically backtracking the story to figure everything out. If you're going to have elements in between that tell a story for people who want to hear it, I don't think there's anything wrong with having a comic book that adds to it. But for the media, you need to, or for any of the media, whether it's, I shouldn't have to play the whole game to understand the comic book necessarily. I shouldn't have to read the comic book to understand what's going on in the game, right? You can do small world building things that pull it together, and people who are in the know, who consume all that content, can enjoy it for how it's put together, if that makes sense. So, but with this, she's just kind of flat out wrong on this situation. D&D already had a lot of these established lores before. I mean, you know, it was a D&D that brought it around, but maybe I'm wrong, but I don't believe Baldur's Gate is what started Faerun. Faerun was already a world within there, and it was built upon it. It may have made Faerun more popular, but it didn't add to it. Now, the world of Faerun has built its own, creative storylines, books, and things like that you can get into. But I can read one Faerun book about Faerun and not have to understand the entire world or go play Baldur's Gate, right? I can just recognize the cities.
Each medium leveraging its strengths to illuminate different aspects of the shared world. Novels could delve into character psychology and historical events. Tabletop sessions could explore player-driven narratives within established frameworks.
Seeing the book made me think of another thing. One great thing you can do with this multimedia idea of having multiple forms of media is you can leave Easter eggs for those players who are in the know, right? I won't understand why this particular droid is sitting here, but someone who read the comic book would. I don't notice it at all because I didn't read the comic book, but that person does, and it makes it more engaging for them, just like any Easter egg would.
Frameworks, and video games could render these worlds interactive. The result was a form of world building greater than the sum of its parts. Crucially, this transmedia
I have to look up Baldur's Gate. This is absolutely killing me. Not 3. Candlekeep website. What is the question? Has bugged me. When was created? In 1967 is when they first came up with the idea of Faerun, and started. Well, it came out, we'll say. Officially detailed in 1987. It was created and designed, and then it became official in 1987. When did? Because I can't remember. When did Baldur's Gate 1 come out? 1998. So either way, Baldur's Gate was already a really established game at that point, right? Or an established title. So again, I think she's wrong here in this particular subject because she's talking about Baldur's Gate.
Extensions weren't just consumed passively but actively integrated into how players experience the games themselves. A player who read R.A. Salvatore Dritt's novels might approach Drow characters in Baldur's Gate with different expectations and interpretations. Someone familiar with the intricate political histories detailed in Elder Scrolls in-game books might make different moral choices when confronted with factional conflicts. The boundary between game and extended universe was permeable, creating feedback loops that enrich both. These extra game materials didn't just feel like filler or marketing, they were a natural extension of the world building. They deepen the lore, offer players new insights, and allow them to experience the universe through different lenses.
So, I think that's more of a... What is it? A product of how RPGs spread across multiple genres of different types of things. Like RPGs work well in tabletop games. They work well in video games. They are great at telling stories, so they work well in books, right? That's those games as a whole come together, and it allows it to spark out that much media, and be engaged with it. Let me listen to that. Maybe I'm speaking out my ass right now.
Filler or marketing. They were a natural extension of the world building. They deepen the lore, offer players new insights, and allow them to experience the universe through different lenses.
Right. Yeah. I still kind of agree with myself here. It's RPGs can expand out into different titles and different types of games and different things like that. But that doesn't mean that a RPG that comes out and it's the first in its franchise is bad because it doesn't have that. That's something that has to be built over time. With Baldur's Gate, it was easy because there was already a tabletop RPG that had been doing the hard work in the story. They only had to tell a small story of the history in the game and keep it accurate to the history of Faerun.
The Mass Effect series, for example, became a full-fledged transmedia property with novels, comics, and an expansive lore archive that drew fans even deeper into its rich universe. But today, much of this holistic world-building has eroded into something far less substantive. Transmedia content now often serves as little more than marketing collateral. Consider the tie-in novels or comics that accompany modern RPGs. They're often released as afterthoughts, designed to plug gaps in the game's narrative rather than expand upon it meaningfully. They serve as a marketing function, giving players just enough to feel like they're getting more but not enough to truly flesh out the world they've come to love. The synchronization of these transmedia elements has also suffered. Where once books and games hold complementary stories within a consistent universe, modern franchises frequently struggle with contradictions between media formats. Retcons become commonplace as marketing priorities shift, eroding player trust in the coherence of this world.
Let me listen to that one more time.
Enough to truly flesh out the world they've come to love. The synchronization of these transmedia elements has also suffered. Where once books and games hold complementary stories within a consistent universe, modern franchises frequently struggle with contradictions between media formats.
Yes. This is due more towards, like, especially when you go game to game, is one team will make the first video game and then a whole nother team within that larger, it comes down to how large corporates are, right? And how messages get mixed between them. There's no one person or one smaller group that is connecting these stories together. It's so corporatized, it can't, there's no way it can keep the consistency up.
Retcons become commonplace as marketing priorities shift, eroding player trust in the coherence of these worlds. The result is a fragmentation of narrative universes, where players increasingly focus only on canon game content and dismiss external materials as unreliable or irrelevant. Perhaps most concerning is how this approach has affected game design itself. As transmedia extensions become more marketing focused and less substantive, games themselves must shoulder the entire burden of world building. This leads to bloated expositions, codex entries that feel disconnected from gameplay, and narrative structures that prioritize setting up sequels over telling complete stories. The game becomes simultaneously overcrowded with lore dumps, yet paradoxically shallow in its world building.
So, this is just a media problem in general, and that happens with everything. People who don't want to put in the work to put in the story drop a character that tells that exposition dumps, right? It's been a common problem in the movie industry and television industry for years, long before gaming even. And gaming is just running into that same problem with storytelling, where they have to get the story out under a timetable, so they have to find ways to tell that story. Movies only really have one way to do that, and that's with some kind of expedition dump or some kind of character giving out the information. And where games have more avenues to be lazy, you can put it into a codex, you can do an expedition dump character, you can put it in a book, or that you can pick up and read. So this isn't a gaming problem, this is just media in general.
This loss of a rich transmedia ecosystem results in RPGs feeling increasingly isolated, their universe confined to the game itself rather than being part of a broader cultural conversation. The RPGs of today risk being games within games, their worlds becoming static, shallow, and forgettable once players put down their controllers. When you think of faction systems done right, follow New Vegas stands as a paragon of the genre. The game allowed players to engage with factions on a profound level, where their choices not only impacted their standing with each group, but also determined the fate of the wasteland. The complexity of the faction system was an intricate web of alliances, betrayals, and moral compromises. Players could choose to ally with the New Californian Republic, the Caesar's Legion, or even go solo. Each choice had consequences that rippled throughout the game's narrative. What made New Vegas particularly remarkable was how it positioned factions not merely as quest givers, but as ideological forces with coherent worldviews. Caesar's Legion wasn't simply evil. They were a response to the chaos of the wasteland, offering brutal order and security at the cost of individual freedom. The NCR represented democratic values and rule of law, but also bureaucratic inefficiency and imperial overreach. Mr. House embodied technocratic utopianism with its promises of progress and its authoritarian undertones. Each faction presented a different vision for humanity's future.
So you could argue with this too, she's just talking about storytelling in general. This isn't something necessarily specific to RPGs. Does the world feel like it's connected? You know, this isn't really an RPG problem as much as it's just in general gaming problem, you know.
Asking players to consider not just which side to support, but what kind of world they wanted to help create. This philosophical depth was matched by mechanical sophistication. The reputation system tracked not just whether factions liked or disliked the player, but whether they were respected, feared, or merely tolerated. A player might be revered by the NCR for their help but still distrusted for past associations with their enemies, a nuance rarely captured in modern systems. Most importantly, these reputations weren't merely cosmetic but determined access to areas, dialogue options, quest possibilities, and ultimately, the narrative branches available to the player. In New Vegas, your relationship with a faction could shift dynamically based on your actions, whether it was completing quests for them, betraying their leaders, or siding with their enemies. This gave the player agency and a genuine sense of influence over their world. The decisions felt meaningful because the consequences were real. If you sided with one faction, you risked alienating another, and each faction had its own goals, philosophy, and role in shaping the game's outcome. The brilliance of this system lay in how it created narrative tension through mechanical constraints. Players couldn't simply max out reputation with every faction. The game forced them to make choices that would inevitably close off certain paths. This,
Like I said, she's talking in the lens of RPGs. This is more a conversation about player choice in games and good storytelling. It's like Baldur's Gate doesn't have the player choice in it. Does that make it bad? Well, no, it's got an engaging story. This really isn't talking about necessarily the mechanics of RPGs. RPGs are so loosely thrown around that pretty much everything has RPG elements now, right? I think this should have been narrowed down more towards some kind of particular RPG or a subset genre, like turn-based and JRPGs or something like that. But it just really feels more like she's talking about the industry as a whole when it comes to story and player choice.
wasn't an artificial limitation, but a reflection of the game's central theme about the impossibility of pleasing everyone in a world of conflicting interests. The faction system wasn't just a gameplay mechanism, it was a narrative device that embodied the game's philosophical exploration of power, governance, and moral compromise. This complexity...
I will say, this probably could have been shorter. There's a lot of looping going on, talking about the nuances and player choice and what's the other one that she's going into? It's not political discussions, but for me, lack of a better word, those deeper representations of people's choice, right? Of people's ideals, right? Conflicting ideals in stories. We're kind of going over the same thing.
It made the world feel alive.
Over and over again.
As though your actions had weight. The faction mechanics weren't just about filling a meter or earning a reputation. They were about understanding the power dynamics and making difficult choices that shape the world in profound ways. Contrast that with the modern iteration of faction system.
Like a good example is we're talking about player choice right now. Player choice is an RPG mechanic, but I would argue that not every game with player choice is an RPG. You know what I mean?
Where reputation meters dominate. In many contemporary RPGs, factions serve more as a checklist to be ticked off than as living, breathing entities with which the player can form real, complex relationships. Actions in these games often don't have lasting consequences. Increasing a faction's reputation by completing a few tasks.
Also, I can build complex relationships without having to have the player choice or the dialogue. I can enjoy a linear style game and fall in love with the characters as I play through it just as much as I can through the dialogue of an RPG, of this RPG mechanic.
Might lead to rewards, but these rewards rarely affect the storyline in a meaningful way. The modern approach typically treats factions as content delivery systems rather than ideological entities. A player can often be simultaneously aligned with groups that should logically be at odds with one another. In games like The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, players can become the leader of the Thieves Guild, the Companions, the College of Winterhold, and the Dark Brotherhood without any meaningful narrative friction between these roles. This approach prioritizes player access to all content over narrative coherence, fundamentally undermining the concept of meaningful choice. Even when games attempt to implement...
Yeah, but when I play Oblivion or Elder Scrolls games, I'm not playing it for that player choice. I'm playing it almost like a theme park. Like Elder Scrolls shines in its gameplay by discovering the environment. I don't need to have multiple playthroughs of Elder Scrolls to feel like I completed it all. But where was I going with this? But I do play it multiple times because sometimes I find something in the world that I hadn't explored yet, right? This is a different dynamic. What makes Elder Scrolls a good video game isn't determined by the choices you have. It's just the individual stories of becoming each of the factions is good within themselves.
In opposing factions, the consequences of alignment are
Hopefully I'm not yapping too much coming up with their arguments.
frequently reduced to cosmetic differences or slightly altered endings rather than fundamentally different gameplay experiences. Players might receive different cutscenes or dialogue, but the core gameplay loop remains unchanged regardless of faction choice. The narrative might acknowledge the player's allegiance, but the game world rarely transforms in response to
Oh
it.
shit. Apparently chat wasn't working because y'all just slammed through. So let me take a look at these. Oh no, it didn't. There we go. I think we are where we are. Same with enemy placement. What happened? Oh, I must have hit something. All right, we'll continue on.
In the modern RPG, factions often feel like a series of disconnected quests that you can complete without engaging in the nuanced storytelling of older games. Factions no longer feel like they have real stakes in the world, and your role within them is often predefined, with minimal impact on the game's ultimate outcome. Instead of struggling with the moral complexities of supporting one faction over another, players are presented with surface-level decisions that don't force them to confront difficult choices.
Yeah, but with the Elder Scrolls, the factions aren't in competition with each other, right? Elder Scrolls is about that individual story that you're going with, right? In Oblivion, it's about the Oblivion Gates. In Skyrim, it's about the dragons. It's there's already an element that's pushing you through the game. These are just side stories that you can get involved in. Like I said, it's more what Elder Scrolls focused on in its games was the exploration and storytelling through that exploration. You can't do everything at the same time. Like I couldn't imagine having to play Oblivion multiple times to get every ending while trying to search the map for everything that might be cool, while making sure that all the factions have some kind of conflict in between them. You know, you have to look at an RPG at what it's trying to present to you in that world and how it's trying to present its story.
This design philosophy reflects a fundamental shift in how developers view player experience. Where older RPGs were willing to lock significant content behind mutually exclusive choices, creating replayability through genuine narrative divergence, modern titles often avoid restricting access to content at all costs. This approach stems partly from development economics. Creating substantial content that many players might never see is considered inefficient. Role-playing games have developer interviews and fan-driven lore.
Oh god.
Easily overcrowded with lore dumps yet paradox. A player might be revered by the actions in these games, but the game world transforms in response to it. Consequence rather than from unlimited. The rich texture of human many players might never see is considered inefficient.
There we go.
It also reflects changing player expectations, with many gamers expressing frustration when they can experience all content in a single playthrough. The reputation systems themselves have been mechanically simplified as well.
I mean, is there something wrong with experiencing all the content in one playthrough? If that's what I'm looking for in the game, or that's the story they're trying to tell, does that make it a bad RPG? There are RPGs I play for that in-depth analysis, and then there are RPGs that I play for the individual story, right? JRPGs are generally a set story within the world that you're getting to play through. You are the character in it, but there's not as much role playing by character choice. Whereas something like Planescape Torment, it's a lot more about the character choice and going through the deep conversations and how each conversation is different, how, you know, no matter how many times you play through and make different choices, we're not really getting to, I guess, the problems with RPGs. We're more kind of looping around the idea that it all has to be this great story that's telling some kind of, God, I hate my brain. Some kind of catch, some kind of political statement, some kind of conflict. The conflict can just be the story itself.
Where New Vegas tracked multiple dimensions of faction relationships, fame, infamy, trust, distrust, most modern systems collapse these nuances into a single meter. This reduction eliminates the possibility of complex.
Yeah, this video does seem to be saying RPGs should do all X, and I agree, different types of games accomplish different things. That's why RPGs became so widespread to begin with, and why other games started drawing in those RPG elements, because you can take one RPG element like character building, put it into a action game, and it makes the game better. As long as it's done well, it makes the game better, right? So yeah, it's just kind of like, should all RPGs be the same? I think that'd be very boring.
Stand-ins, being simultaneously feared and respected, or being distrusted despite providing valuable assistance. The rich texture of human relationships is flooded into a simplistic approval rating that rises and falls predictably based on quest completion. This lack of narrative depth diminishes the impact of the faction systems, reducing what was once an intricate web of interwoven stories into a series of automated, predictable interactions that lack the weight of their predecessors.
Well, I mean, this is another thing, it's just laziness that comes down to it. A game, whether it's an RPG or not, will throw faction mechanics in to check a box over using those faction mechanics to increase the interaction engagement with the game, right? So this also isn't a RPG specific thing. This is an RPG element that is being used lazily by the entire market.
The player becomes less an agent making consequential choices in a reactive world and more a tourist passing through various content zones, collecting experiences without leaving a meaningful mark on the game's universe. The decline of complex faction systems represents more than just a mechanical simplification. It signifies a philosophical retreat from the idea that meaningful role-playing emerges from limitation in consequence rather than from unlimited agency. When players can experience everything without sacrifice, choose any path without closing others, and maintain positive relationships with everyone regardless of their actions, the very concept of role-playing, of inhabiting a specific character with specific allegiances and values, is fundamentally compromised. Romance in RPG.
And this kind of goes into, like, she's talking about specifically faction mechanics right here. It's faction mechanics are done better when there's conflict, you know, between when God, it's lazy to do the faction mechanics if you have differing, like, opinions, differing ideals, and you can be friends with both of them. I can see where she's going there. It really depends on how it's done. You know, there are games that see you as a mercenary. You may work for all factions, and none of them trust you, but they'll all have a good, you have a good reputation with them. This isn't, it's like one gameplay mechanic. Yeah, not every RPG needs factions. If factions are done well, they add more to it. But this isn't necessary. This is an RPG mechanic that can make it into any game. And if it's done lazy, it's bad. That's, you know, if it's done lazy, it's bad.
Has undergone a dramatic transformation, from an optional, deeply integrated narrative element to a primary mechanic often designed to please the masses. In the early days of RPGs, romances were woven seamlessly into the broader story. Take Baldur's Gate, where romance options were not a central focus, but a means of exploring the emotional complexity of the characters. These romances felt like natural extensions of the characters' personalities and the player's role in the world, rather than.
And now we're moving into romances. I think this would have been better if the chapters felt more separated. You know what I mean?
A mechanic designed for the sake of player satisfaction. What made these early romantic narratives compelling was their unpredictability and narrative integration. Characters like Viconia and Baldur's Gate 2 brought their own agendas, traumas, and worldviews to their relationships with the player character. These weren't simply romance options, but fully realized personalities whose capacity for romantic attachment was one facet of their complex characterization. A romance with Viconia wasn't merely about pursuing a drow companion, but about navigating her complicated relationship with surface dwellers, her traumatic past, and her evolving moral compass. These relationships could challenge players in ways that modern romances rarely attempt. Characters might disagree with the player's choices, abandon the party if their personal ethics were compromised, or even betray the protagonist if their goals diverged significantly. This unpredictability created genuine emotional stakes. The player couldn't simply select the correct dialogue option to guarantee a successful relationship, but had to engage with the character as a complex individual with their own motivations and boundaries.
Not always. Like, sometimes, like, it's the same thing. If this mechanic is in a game and it's done lazily, where you just pick the heart option, then yeah, it's a bad mechanic. But does every game need romances? Is it? It still comes down to industry laziness and bloat over the death of Western RPGs, right?
These relationships weren't just about fulfilling a desire for a romantic subplot. They were about exploring a deep connection with another person, even if that connection could influence the narrative or change the character's role in the story. The Witcher 3, despite its rich narrative, exemplifies the modern approach, where romance is often treated as a side quest, one that requires specific actions or dialogues to unlock, rather than something that evolves organically within the context of the story. The codification.
Yeah, but I'd argue that what Witcher 3 does, as I'm defending Witcher 3 a lot here, is you already see that nuance with the characters as it is. It's just it's a choice. Like the romance is already there with Geralt. He's got his two side character chicks, and he he interacts with them throughout the story without needing to choose mechanics. And then it just gives you a choice. Do you want to see the romance? Hey, do you want to see him fuck? Push this button. That's kind of where that goes to. There's still a deep connection that you can view between Yennefer and Geralt. It's just not done in the player choice mechanic. It's done through the storytelling itself.
Of romance as a discrete game system rather than a narrative possibility represents one of the most significant shifts in how RPGs approach character relationships. Modern games typically flag romantic possibilities explicitly, using interface elements like heart.
And if I remember right, the heart option came before things became more nuanced, right? I mean, I can't remember a single game. Yeah, so you girls can fight over romance in games. I'm going to opt out of it. Yeah, so I've done it in the past, especially when I was a horned up little teen wanting to see the romance scenes in Mass Effect. Not that there was anything to see, but it's become too much. I love Baldur's Gate. By far one of my favorite games, even though I've barely gotten to chapter 2 or act 2. But where it's really well and I want to do the romance styles is in it's more than just pick the right dialogue. There's a whole story involved with it. The problem I have is I've kind of become a prude in my old age, and I don't really care to see players fucking on screen. Right? I don't need the character models to fuck any more than I really care to see it in a movie. Just, you don't have to show more. You can show less in those incidences and leave it up to the player's imagination. But I'm not a gooner, I guess, so.
Icons or relationship meters to signal when a conversation has romantic implications.
And I would argue, too, until Baldur's Gate 3 came out, there wasn't a lot of nuance in these romances things. Yeah, there were dialogues you could pick to go towards it, but you never went on a date with one of the other characters. You never sat on a rock talking about your feelings and drinking wine. It was like there's still a specific dialogue to make them like you. The stories were just better while doing it.
Approach removes ambiguity and surprise from these interactions, reducing what should be complex emotional terrain to a series of clearly marked choices with predictable outcomes. In more recent RPGs, romance has become a reward system, where players can earn the affections of their companions as a form of progression or validation. These relationships often feel shallow and more like a dating simulation.
I think it's more gooners want to get to the fuck scene, right?
Than a natural evolution of character interaction. Romance in these games is no longer about deep emotional exploration, but about unlocking rewards and achieving a sense of completion. This mechanical approach extends beyond just dialogue choices. In many modern RPGs, relationship progression follows predictable patterns: initial meeting followed by a personal quest, culminating in a romantic scene that serves as a capstone to the relationship arc. This formulaic structure places romance on the same plane as equipment upgrades or skill trees, another system to be optimized rather than an organic narrative possibility. Players quickly learn to recognize and follow these patterns, turning what should be emotionally resonant experiences into checklist items. The standardization of romance mechanics across the industry has further eroded their narrative impact. Players now expect certain conventions: the ability to pursue multiple romantic interests simultaneously until a lock-in point, romantic scenes as rewards for relationship completion, and minimal consequences for relationship choices. These expectations create.
I mean, it's because gamers don't want to spend hours in a game trying to get to the romance scene that they want, if that's what they're looking for, right? I would, my complaint with a lot of the romance scenes my complaint isn't about the romance scenes in a game like Cyberpunk. It's that people were bitching about one of the characters being canonically gay, right? Well, she's the hot one. I should get to fuck her. Oh, but now you seem to care that a canonically straight character in a video game has a gay scene. So it's a hypocrisy.
great development constraints that limit narrative innovation in how games approach romantic relationships. Perhaps most concerning is how this approach flattens character psychology. Where romance in earlier RPGs could reveal unexpected dimensions of companions, vulnerabilities, desires, or moral complexities not evident in their general characterization, modern romances often simply amplify traits already present in the character's public persona. The brooding character becomes more introspective, the flirtatious character more overtly sexual, the stoic warrior more protective. These predictable developments offer few genuine surprises or insights into character psychology. This transformation.
So again, we're kind of back to the storytelling in general in the gaming industry is bad, especially in the AAA industry where there's more of an emphasis on pushing out the product so it can make money versus telling a compelling story. Still really isn't an RPG mechanic or, RPG thing. It's a storytelling element. The difference is she's talking about it through the lens of player choice in a romance scene for that specific type, right?
Transformation reflects a broader.
I could literally say this about any story game that's out there. Is the characters are very one-dimensional, very light on any kind of character traits, and you never see any growth from them. Doesn't matter if it's an RPG or a action game.
Simplification of character interaction in modern RPGs. Companies who once had complex motivations, personal quests that could be fail or refuse, and the ability to leave the party if sufficiently alienated have largely been replaced by eternally loyal followers whose personal content exists primarily to strengthen their bond with the protagonist. The result is relationships that feel less like genuine connections between complex individuals and more like achievement paths designed to maximize the player's satisfaction. The mechanization of romance has not only diminished its narrative potential, but also reinforced problematic patterns in how games approach interpersonal relationships. When romance becomes a system to be mastered rather than a narrative possibility to be explored, it implicitly frames relationships as transactional. Complete this task, select these dialogue options, and earn affection as a reward.
This is a very woman statement. Like it becomes transactional, I guess, but that's all of the view of the person who's playing it. Not everyone who goes through the romance scenes is going to do it for the nuanced takes or the nuanced interpersonal relationships. If that's what they're looking for, sure. But if they're looking to just complete it, they'll skip through the whole thing.
This approach risks reducing companions to prizes to be won rather than individuals to be understood, a particularly troubling framework given gaming's ongoing struggles with representation and objectification. What has been lost in this evolution is the very essence of what made romantic narratives compelling in RPGs, their capacity to surprise, challenge, and even disappoint players in ways that feel.
Again, I would argue that romantic relationships in games outside single player experiences with them, or single story experiences, not player choice experiences. I completely lost it. Let me reword that. Is single linear stories used to be a lot better at telling that romance interaction. But I would argue that in a player choice environment, it's always been for very surface level on those side. Yeah, they could tell the story well to get into it, but a lot of the picking the choices to make the person fall in love with you were fairly surface level going through it. The story in between after you pick the right choice may be good, maybe not. Again, I'm going to glaze Baldur's Gate 3 and say, like, that's the first game where I felt like the interpersonal relationships were deeper than something else, you know? There was definitely some, but a lot of it was click this, like Mass Effect. It was, you would talk to the characters, but it was more click this to hear their story, hear their backstory. Even in Baldur's Gate, you could say that. It's click this to hear more about their takes. Yes, there was the ability to lose characters because you made the wrong choices, but a lot of that had to do more with the outside world than completely with the way you talk to them. If you were evil in Baldur's Gate 3, you would lose your good characters and vice versa.
Emotionally authentic. By prioritizing player satisfaction over narrative coherence, modern RPGs have created romance systems that are more accessible but ultimately less meaningful, offering the illusion of emotional connection without the narrative depth or complexity that would make these relationships truly resonant. The evolution of open-world design in RPGs represents one of the most profound transformations in gaming, from carefully bounded explorations to seemingly limitless expanses promising freedom without restraint. This shift has not been made without significant cost. What began as a genuine innovation in player agency has devolved into a marketing metric, where the square mileage of a game world has become more important than the density of meaningful experiences contained within it. Starfield stands as perhaps the most emblematic example of this misguided philosophy. Bethesda's promise of over 1,000 explorable planets exemplifies the fundamental misunderstanding that has infected modern RPG design, the conflation of size with substance. These numerically impressive worlds offer an illusion of infinity that quickly reveals itself as repetition disguised as variety. Players find themselves traversing not unique environments but variations on a limited set of algorithmic templates, mountains with a slightly different coloration, deserts with marginally altered rock formations, forests distinguished only by trivial difference in flora density. This approach represents a profound misreading of what made early open worlds compelling. Games like Morrowind captivated
Old man moment.
players not through sheer size but
Wrong
through
button.
cultural depth, architectural distinctiveness, and ecological coherence. Each region felt like a place shaped by history and inhabited by people with comprehensible social structures. By contrast, the procedurally generated planets of games like Starfield and No Man's Sky present themselves as geological curiosities rather than living worlds, offering little evidence of organic development or meaningful habitation. The mechanical implementation of these open worlds has further eroded their narrative potential.
Well, like this comparison, I think if I was her with this, I would get more into the meat of the change from Bethesda, because that's really what she's trying to get to with this. Bethesda used to tell its stories through its worlds, right? It did it with Fallout, it did it with Elder Scrolls, and then you get to Starfield, and it went from making a world you can explore to a pre-generated mess with nothing interesting to explore. You really had no choice to explore in that game. So that's more of a specific, like, hey, split it up into world building storytelling in RPGs, romance or player choice in RPGs, character development in RPGs. You could talk about each of the individual styles of RPGs, versus this kind of going through and putting all RPGs into a bundle. The problem is RPGs it's such a vast, and I'm probably looping on this anyway, vast genre of games. I would argue the largest of the genre of games in terms of subtypes. So it just kind of sounds like what you said, Vincent, that all RPGs need to have all of these mechanics to be considered a good RPG.
What was once genuine exploration, the act of discovering the unknown through curiosity and observation, has been reduced to following waypoint markers across vast, empty terrains. The journey between objectives has become a form of tedium rather than an opportunity for discovery, with players often resorting to fast travel systems that effectively acknowledge the emptiness of the spaces between narrative nodes. This design approach transforms exploration from an active engagement with a richly realized world into a checklist of locations to.
And here's another thing, like Assassin's Creed is not an RPG game, period. Like, that's full stop. When game names. When this game came out, Assassin's Creed gave up its identity for RPG mechanics and a wider audience. But this game is not an RPG game. It's just it's what Ubi Slop has always been, a big map with markers to go after. I would have left this out in general, or at least these screenshots.
To be systematically cleared. The map interface, once a tool to aid navigation, has become the primary lens through which players experience these worlds, a series of icons representing content to be consumed rather than a territory to be understood.
This isn't an RPG problem, this is an open world problem. You know, and mostly a Ubisoft open world problem. Elder Scrolls has an open world map, and that has been, it's the idea of open worlds started with RPGs, but there are other games that are there are other games that use this mechanic that aren't RPGs. Assassin's Creed being one of them. I haven't played Forspoken, but it seemed more like an action game with RPG elements in it that told a shitty story. There needs to be more of a narrowed focus on what we're talking about when it comes to RPGs.
The player's relationship with the game world is fundamentally altered. Rather than inhabiting a space, they move between content islands in an otherwise barren sea. The proliferation of collectibles and resource nodes as the primary form of environmental interaction further demonstrates this impoverishment of design. Where early RPGs used environmental storytelling to create narrative context, abandoned camps with evidence of what transpired, ruins with architectural clues about past civilizations, modern open worlds often substitute these thoughtful touches with generic resource deposits and standardized enemy encounters that could exist anywhere, untethered from any sense of place or purpose. This expansiveness has not only affected environmental design, but has fundamentally altered how stories can be told within these spaces. The vastness of modern open worlds creates an irreconcilable tension between narrative coherence and player freedom. When critical story missions can be indefinitely postponed while players wander across enormous territories, the sense of urgency or emotional investment in central conflicts inevitably diminishes. Games like Skyrim demonstrate how this tension can undermine storytelling, with world-threatening crises that patiently wait for the player to complete hundreds of unrelated side activities before addressing them. The narrative
Yeah, but this has been oh, I mean, I think this is a bad example of it. Like, this has been a Elder Scrolls thing since the beginning. It's well, I don't know about since the beginning, since they became popular. I don't even remember if Morrowind, I remember so little about besides the other things. So I don't remember if the overarching story was an end of the world scenario, but Oblivion definitely was. And you still want to run off to these little side quests. This is more of a gaming and media always trying to turn everything into an into the world scenario, which makes the player feel rushed, but adding in toys to play with. Again, not really an RPG problem, more of a storytelling problem in the gaming industry as a whole.
Dissonance created by this approach, where the supposed apocalyptic threat never actually advances despite in-game days and weeks passing, erodes the player's ability to meaningfully engage with the central story. More concerning is how this expanded scale has affected character writing. With resources stretched across vast territories and countless quests, the depth of characterization has suffered accordingly. Side characters who might once have received nuanced development are reduced to quest dispensers with minimal.
Hey, Vincent, don't be afraid. I'm a man. I can take it. Sometimes less is more. I agree. I remember being a kid and like open world has become a problem where it always has to be bigger and bigger and bigger, but there's no content inside of it. Having a shit ton of dialogue can be great, but sometimes telling the smaller story can be better. When it comes to the stakes of the game, it doesn't always have to be a world-ending event. It can be a small story and be good, and you can build up to something larger in the next one, where a lot of games go for world-ending event after world-ending event and things like that. So, but bring it, Vincent. I'm not fucking scared of you.
Personality beyond their immediate function. The quantity of NPCs has expanded while their individual complexity has contracted, resulting in worlds that feel paradoxically less populated despite containing more characters. What has been lost in this pursuit of expansiveness is the understanding that limitations can foster creativity. The more bounded worlds of early RPGs encourage developers to maximize the narrative potential of each location.
A lot of this, I'm saying, she's looping quite a bit. Like, even when she talks about different subjects, a lot of it is the same thing about depth and nuance and character development and things like that. It could have been shortened down quite a lot. There's just a lot of hearing the same thing over and over again.
To ensure that every accessible area contains something
But women be yapping, so
worth discovering. The finite nature of these worlds created a density of experience that made exploration genuinely rewarding rather than merely time-consuming. The path forward for open-world RPGs lies not in ever-expanding territories, but in returning to this principle of meaningful density, creating worlds that may be smaller in raw geographic terms, but richer in narrative possibility and interactive potential. Some developers have begun to recognize this, crafting more contained experiences where the boundaries serve not as limitations but as focusing mechanisms for more carefully designed content. Until the industry broadly reconsiders its equation of scale with value, players will continue to find themselves adrift in beautiful but empty digital landscapes, technically impressive but emotionally hollow, offering the superficial appearance of limitless possibility while actually constraining the depth of interaction that makes RPGs truly meaningful. The vastness of these worlds has become not a feature but a symptom of design philosophy that has lost sight of why players explore virtual spaces, not to wander aimlessly, but to discover stories worth experiencing. The Western RPG stands at a crucial crossroads, one path continuing towards further dilution and mechanical homogenization, the other leading back towards the rich narrative soil from which the genre first grew. This moment of uncertainty presents not just a challenge but an opportunity for profound reinvention. The genre's salvation lies not in abandoning its evolution entirely, but in rediscovering the fundamental principles that made role-playing games uniquely powerful as interactive experiences. What made classical RPGs compelling was never merely their systems or their scale, but their commitment to player agency within coherent narrative frameworks. These games understood that meaningful choice requires consequences that reshape not just immediate outcomes but the broader trajectory of the player's journey. The degradation of choice into cosmetic variations of the same essential path represents perhaps the most significant betrayal of the genre's potential, reducing what should have been transformative decisions into mere aesthetic preferences. Signs of revival already exist on the periphery of mainstream development. Studios like Larian have demonstrated with Baldur's Gate 3 that players hunger for genuine consequence in their choices, for worlds that respond to not just different dialogue but with fundamentally altered paths forward. These experiences remind us that the true power of the RPG lies not in the breadth of its world, but in the depth of its responsiveness to player action. The resurrection of the Western RPG requires a recalibration of priorities, away from the market-driven impulse towards universal accessibility and back towards the understanding that depth sometimes requires complexity. Not every game must appeal to every player. Indeed, the most memorable experiences often emerge from developers who embrace the specific nature of their vision rather than diluting it to reach the broadest possible audience. Part of this renewal must include a recognition that limitations can foster creativity rather than constrain it. The most narratively rich RPGs have often been those with clearly defined boundaries, both in their worlds and their systems, that allow developers to focus on creating density of experience rather than expanse of territory. A return to more concentrated design would permit the kind of handcrafted detail and narrative intricacy that procedural generation and endless scale inevitably sacrifice. Character development, too, must reclaim its position at the heart of the genre. The reduction of companions to mechanical assets or romantic conquest has diminished what was once the emotional core of the RPG experience. The formation of complex relationships with virtual people whose perspectives and growth intertwine meaningfully with the player's journey. The next generation of RPGs must treat their characters not as content delivery mechanisms, but as essential elements of a living narrative ecosystem. What lies ahead of the Western RPG is ultimately unwritten, a blank page that developers and players alike will fill through their choices in the coming years. The genre's true potential remains largely untapped despite decades of evolution. The possibility of creating not just games, but interactive narrative spaces where players can explore more complexity, philosophical dilemmas, and emotional depth through the power of embodied choice. This potential resurrection will require courage, from developers willing to prioritize depth over marketability, from publishers willing to support more focused visions, and from players willing to embrace experiences that challenge rather than merely entertain. It will demand a collective return to the understanding that role-playing games are not merely about becoming more powerful within a system, but about exploring the consequences of meaningful choices within richly realized worlds. The Western RPG is not dying but dormant, waiting for the right combination of vision and execution to reawaken its potential. The path forward will not be found in chasing technological spectacle.
It's already been reawakened. We're in the new golden age of RPGs.
Or in endlessly expanded empty worlds, but in returning to the essential truth that has always defined the genre at its best, that the most compelling gameplay emerges not from systems alone, but from the meaningful intersection of player agency with narrative consequence. In this intersection lies the future of role-playing games, not as mere entertainment products,
I've already said the problem I have with the video. I get it, but thinking RPG should be just one thing and not allowing for exploration is game design bugs. Yeah, RPGs is such a broad topic, like I said, about like what specifically in the Western RPG genre, because all different types of RPGs have changed over the years. Examples would have helped. Oh, Bugs Me. Got it. Yeah. Like examples would have been really good. Like if you're comparing, if we're going to talk about a genre, let's talk about like the Elder Scroll type game of exploring worlds. What's made that fucking diluted? What's made that worse? You know, I argue CRPGs have always been a sleeper game. It's always been very, very niche. I love CRPGs, but they're not AAA quality games because they're a niche game that no one wants to play. But at the jump of Baldur's Gate 3 and games like Warhammer 40K, Rogue Trader, it jumped those games into the limelight. You know, even Pathfinder didn't. So like CRPGs went from being a game no one played to a smash hit with a game that people will play. Will they have the same? Will Valerian have the same success with their next game, since it's not going to be in the D&D world? That's yet to be seen. It'll probably still be a good game, but I don't know that they will sell the same numbers. It just needs to. It's too broad, and her speaking on it is very overly complicated. I think she could do with simpling down what she's trying to say, giving examples, and focusing on an area. Like you probably, yeah, exactly. Just going back to the past styles, like we aren't doing anything new. A lot of the mechanics she talks about didn't exist until later on, right? While there is some player consequence in some of the older games that like Fallout 1, that disappeared until pretty much until Mass Effect came out. Risk versus reward, right? You want to. The games that are doing well always seem to be the ones that take that risk. What people don't realize, though, is for every game that's a breakout success because they took a risk, there's thousands of games that failed. Probably even at this point, millions of games that failed with the amount that we have coming out here. We're pretty much done. Let me see if she's got anything else to say.
A powerful vehicle for interactive storytelling whose potential we have only begun to explore.
So I definitely, I don't know that I agree with much on the video. There are some points I can agree with, but it's just way too broad to come at RPGs as a whole in the Western world. You know, And I think her video is a little late, seeing as the change in RPGs has been massive. We've got Baldur's Gate 3, we've got the rise of CRPGs in general, Expedition 33, which I'll probably be playing tomorrow night. It's you're seeing the change. The change is already happening in there, but a lot of these mechanics are, while taken from the RPG genre, are widely used in other games because of the innovation that the RPG drama genre had as a whole. Yeah, this is why the AAA industry is so stagnant. They can't afford to take risks. Yeah, they can't. They see a mechanic that they want to put out there, or they see a mechanic that's successful, and they pull it into their game without really understanding why players engage with it. And they may get it right the first time, but it usually gets diluted down the way. Or like the Assassin's Creed series, they start throwing every mechanic they can in, ignoring what made the games good. It looks good, but you have the traditionist who be like that woke because it's not what they are used to. Yeah, I mean, it comes down to it. I had that guy you were watching me argue with, his one of his nuanced takes, quote unquote, was that Starfield had colored women leading their factions, and I was like, okay, tell me more about these colored women. Were they the annoying girl boss character that just takes you completely out of the game, or were they just surface level characters like the rest of Starfield? NPC talking points, exactly. Oh man. And then they call me NPC. So I think she has the work to go. I don't know if this is her first stripe into this video, but she took on a big topic. New Ray, if you listen to any of this and make it to the end, I say find a more focused on it. Give examples of what you were talking about and compare it to modern games. Like find the old one, compare it to the modern one. And use dumber language, because most of us on the internet are retards and we just want to be able to listen to it while we play our favorite game. What do you think, Vince? You got anything for her? Anyone else who's left in chat want to chime in? Yeah, I agree. It's very video essayist, but a lot of good video essayists. Good night, Vince. I'm about to get off myself anyway. So we'll just call it there then. Needs a little bit of work, needs a little bit of structure. I don't really agree with her points on RPGs. I'd like to have a more nuanced conversation with her. Man, my throat's getting all itchy. But anyways, that's the video, The Death of Western Games. Thank you, everybody, for coming out and chatting with me. If you're watching afterwards and you like the video, like and subscribe. And I want to do more of these type of reaction videos, especially around gaming. All right, later, guys.